Okay.
Thanks, Ann. Awesome. So as we get into this process a bit, I'm going to invite us to just create a pause. So one of the practices, particularly in circle process, is to get present with ourselves. And I don't know about y'all, but my day has already been quite full. And so just an invitation to take a couple deep breaths. Give yourself permission to slow down and engage in this process for yourself, but also, especially for my providers in the space, to engage in this with an intention of service. Just another moment here to be in a slow and still pace. All right. So a little intro on me. My name is Nikki. I run an organization here on Vashon Island called Journeyman. And through that role, I have the honor of facilitating a lot of different groups and activities. A lot of these are focused on youth. But one of the things that's very close to my heart as a father is creating spaces for men and for dads to connect with themselves and really deepen in a practice of emotional support and also kind of group process. I do a lot of trainings through the org and elsewhere, and I think one of the most important key roles that I get to center in this experience is being a dad to 3 lovely kiddos. I also want to mention too, I'm joined by 2 other father practitioners, Brian and Kenny. We're going to get to hear from Brian and Kenny a lot more in a little bit, but I want to acknowledge them. They're friends of mine. They've stepped into this work as participants, but also are very skilled facilitators. And yeah, I'm really grateful to have both of them here to share their experience and wisdom with y'all, particularly in a little bit. So thanks, Kenny, and thanks, Brian. A little bit about how our flow will work. So we're here until 1 p.m. I hope everybody can stay. We're going to have time and space for Q&A. So if you got questions bubbling up, know that we will definitely dedicate some time for that at the end. This is going to be a combination of me sharing information, but also you contributing. And I really want to lean on the experiential side. But we're going to cover an intro to circle process. Really, like, what do I mean when I say circle process? We're going to get to practice being in a circle together. And then we're going to discuss and identify some applications for actually putting this into practice for ourselves or for the dads that we serve. And my hope in outcomes from our time today is you get a basic understanding of circles. So when you hear the word circle process or counsel, you really know exactly what we're talking about. I want you all to have a meaningful personal experience today. And I think that'll come through our practice and breakout rooms. And I'll really closing with some commitment that you can make towards putting something from what we've done today into practice. All right, so how to engage. I'm going to propose a couple of different, invitations for us to consider. One, I want to acknowledge that a lot of y'all are experts and you are all experts in the content area of your life. But some of you, have significant experience in maybe group facilitation, maybe your particular field. And I want to invite you to come into this with a lot of curiosity. And really to be curious about the experiences of other people. That's one of the core practices or kind of outcomes from engaging in circle. I want you all to contribute. And this confidentiality one's tricky because this is being recorded, and I'm thinking about this through the lens of really when we're in our breakout rooms. So when we're in breakouts, we can stop the recording. And my ask is that when other people are sharing, their experience, that obviously we're not going to repeat that back and share that outside of that conversation. But as Ann mentioned, this is a recorded call, and the rest of it, assume that it could be publicly available. And here's an engagement piece. Like, if you're good with these, if you can practice this for our time together, I'm going to invite you to just type into the chat, "I'm in." And that helps me and you really get a sense of like, okay, can I participate in this way? I'd love for some contribution, particularly it's going to help me as a facilitator make this relevant. If you're in, let me know. So let's get right into it. Introduction to circle process. What do we mean when we say circles or council? So first of all, I use these words interchangeably. In my training and lineage, which primarily has been through the Ojai Foundation in California, the word council is used. And in a lot of the school-based work that I do, educational institutions are traditionally calling this circle process or circle practice. And so they essentially are referring to the same thing. Circle process is a group communication and connection tool, and usually it's in an actual circle, hence the name. It often involves the use of forms to facilitate authentic expression. And when I say the word form, I'm really talking about just a way that we maybe move our opportunities to share around a space. This could be passing a talking piece. This could be sharing spontaneously, depending on the prompt, or it could be maybe even breaking out into dyads or pairs to engage in a process with one other person. But council can look a lot of different ways, but it almost always involves a talking piece and almost always involves an actual circle shape. Circle is beautiful because it allows us to be seen and heard and supported without giving advice. And so for my therapists in the room, this is a really interesting experience, I think, to be facilitating a space where the intention is really just around witnessing and acceptance. And it's a really great complement to therapeutic models and one-on-one talk therapy. And I think Kenny could speak more to that because that's his professional background too. And finally, council is usually guided by group agreements and some core intentions that we'll get into a little bit later. And this is really what differentiates it from like just talking to each other in a discussion. Here's a couple applications and examples of like how circle process is used, I want to say pretty widely across different fields. A lot of support groups will use variations of circles. AA is an example that comes up, but there's various other examples. Community building. So I do this a lot with schools where we use circles to really establish a sense of trust and belonging for everybody in a space. It's a fantastic tool for storytelling and celebration. In fact, some of our most profound processes at Journeyman, they use a word we call honoring, and we do our honoring process in a version of a circle. We can use it to process emotions. It's really widely used for healing modalities and peacemaking, particularly in restorative justice and repair. Those of you who've worked in the justice system know, I'm sure, about applications of circle process in really addressing harm and as I want to say, an important tool in moving beyond just punitive justice. And finally, in consensus decision making. And for those of us who are here really in service to dads, I want to identify like a core program that we developed that we called Men's Council. And this was really circles dedicated to men. And, even though we didn't label it first as being for fathers, not surprisingly, we had a ton of dads who opted into the experience. And this involved consistent, regular sessions. Typically it was evenings or weekends, like once a week, and simple and intentional prompts. We have themes and some other activities that really build, I want to say, in addition to talking circles, a little bit more embodiment practice. And typically we'd have 1 to 2 trained facilitators. Sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're volunteer. And my favorite part is when we get the intergenerational effect. We like to include elders, and it's really amazing when we have, young guys, but also a lot of older guys and span multiple generations for that diversity of experience. So I want to zoom out a little bit now and ask the question, why? Like, why are circles important? And what is really the impact and the outcomes and effect of these practices? I want to start with this quote. This is a really beautiful quote that I actually was inspired to share back from the Ojai Foundation's lineage as one of their source Teachers. The beauty of the circle is that we cannot see each other's back, and the strength of the circle is that we can only see each other's beauty. And that's from Uncle Angakak. And I can't pronounce the last name well, but he's an Eskimo and Kalalit elder from native Greenland. And finally, another quote here from Patty Henry, author of The Emotionally Unavailable Man. Circles create a space for men to break through emotional barriers and engage in social risk-taking in a way that they may never have experienced before. And that's really a common, I want to say, response that I get from men who have never had a brave and safe enough space to be fully vulnerable and be real and honest about their experience in life. Those of us who've probably dove into the data around masculinity and conditioning for men can probably see the added impact of this work specifically for those conditioned as male. And I shared this slide the last time that I did a session with the provider series, and I wanted to bring it back because it's really impactful to me. So really, since we've been processing the impacts of the Me Too movement, and there's been a lot of scrutiny around what we would call toxic masculinity or just masculine conditioning, there's like a lot of mental health challenges that men experience in this process. If we compound that with what the US Surgeon General calls the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, we can really see that men are really struggling to find places of belonging and for that to be a regular part of their life, particularly outside of work. Other trends like video game use and addiction, porn, and economic pressures, particularly thinking about the rise of AI and the loss of a lot of jobs. These things are really, causing some pressure points for a lot of men and dads. And this graph over here on the right is really, I think to me, alarming. And it really asks men to respond to the question or the prompt, whether they agree or not. Nobody really knows me well. Nobody really knows me well, right? And if we look at Gen Z, we can see how high that number is, and it starts to decline, right, in these older generations. And for one, the rate of response to this is incredibly alarming on its own, that, almost 2/3 in some of these and over half of every category would agree with that. To me is unacceptable. But also that it's predominantly affecting younger generations and it's getting worse. And I'm curious too, like for you to engage, for those of you who do have a background in maybe some of this research or have stats or quotes, I'd be curious to see some of those in the chat. Like, do you have any interesting, little bits of info, stats, or quotes that sort of help illuminate what's going on for men and the need for these types of experiences? And here's a little bit about like what brain science tells us. I'm really grateful that there's, I think, more and more emerging research on mental health, but particularly the impacts for men. And some of this was helpful for me to really piece together the importance of these types of practices and the impact really on our neurobiology. Oxytocin is sometimes referred to as a cuddle hormone. This is one that's really responsible for us to feel like comfort and trust. And the spaces that are provided through circle practice, they really boost this sense of oxytocin, the sense of like letting our guard down, feeling connected and trustworthy with other people, particularly with other men. Circle practices enhance what we call emotional neuroplasticity. This is the ability to like form new pathways of emotional processing. And finally, it helps regulate fear, particularly in the amygdala, like the part of our brain that is responsible for that fight or flight, and when dysregulated can really shut off higher level cognitive process. So when we think about these things, like particularly regulating fear and improving emotional expression, I just want us to think about like, what does that mean in terms of impact to children? Like, what does it mean for our kids to be around fathers who have improved skills in emotional regulation and expression? What might that do for us as a culture, as a community? And here's some feedback from our participants, like the folks who've been in our like men's council reported these in their evals. I feel more connected to myself, 87%. I've received supportive feedback from others. My relationships with others have improved. I'm more aware of my shadow. That's a really interesting one. For those of you who didn't study Jungian psychology, I'll just say that's a question that participants would understand, but you might not know what that means. We define shadow as the aspect of ourselves that we can't see. And oftentimes it's like the insidious, I want to say, darker parts that we unconsciously hide from ourselves. And we need the conscious witnessing from other people to be able to see those ways that we show up. And it's a really interesting stat to put in there that 78% of our participants are saying, I'm more aware of that because I've gotten honest reflection from some other men. And then down at the bottom, this is really inspiring for me. These are men that were saying, I would like to participate in additional training and facilitation. So a lot of men participate and then get the itch to like deepen their practice and maybe form some leadership skills in it. And I'm curious too, like which data or quote is most impactful to you when you think about everything that was just shared? Go ahead and type that into the chat and tune into what others are saying. So now I want to really center the voices of our father practitioners here. We have Kenny Alton and Brian Palermo, and I've prompted them with a couple of leading questions, like why is this work important for fathers and what has your experience shown? But I'm actually going to pop off my screen share for a minute, just so you're not seeing me in the slides. And I think we can start with Brian, just because you're on my left and I read left to right. And I would love to hear, yeah, just a little bit from you about your experience and maybe why it's important.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. For the next 5 minutes, you got morning. I am Brian Palermo. I'm a recent transplant to Pacific Northwest, just 3 years and some change. I love nature. I love the outdoors. I'm a father of two teen boys. I really value play and connection as a human sort of interactivity and relationship bonding element. I was part of the entertainment industry for 30 years and now mostly a facilitator for various things that fall under the umbrella of communication, interpersonal communication, presentation skills, generating creativity, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically, I work with a lot of hard scientists, helping them with their interpersonal skills and with presentation skills. I was in the gig economy for 30 years. It made me somewhat comfortable with instability, but when I moved up here 3 years ago, it was mid-COVID. We had transitioned an entire family 1,000 miles from our home base, was leaving a big part of the industry behind. I was really sort of looking for connection in a new place. I was a little unstable and I was uncomfortable with it. So I signed up for a Journeyman's Men's Council, not knowing exactly what it was. And I went in thinking this could be practical or this could be a lot of woo-woo PNW BS, and I have no idea if I'm going to get value out of it. And I loved it. It was, I think, 8 weeks, 8 meetings. My takeaway was it's a chance to connect even when you're a little bit anxious about it. I'm an outgoing person, but I'm not somebody who just immediately sits down and let's start talking about career and sex and relationship and politics and debt. Those hard subjects are hard. Having a space like the Men's Council was extremely advantageous for me. And I'm happy to be here and share about it.
Thanks, Brian. I'm really glad you're here. We'll flip it over to Kenny. Kenny, I'd love to hear a little brief bio and then for you to share a little response to, yeah, why is this work important and what's your experience shown?
Hi, my name is Kenny. I've been with Journeyman for I think 6 years now, running school circles. I've been focusing on the middle school here. I've done camps with Journeyman. Last summer, I did the middle school camp, the sort of like that age group, the high school, and I was the dad lead for the Passing the Torch, which is a father-son camp. I am a therapist at Vashon Youth and Family Services. I was a substitute teacher in the Vashon School District for a while. And I ran the men's circle last spring. What I believe is most important, there's so much I could say about why circles need to be. I think one of the bottom lines for me is teaching how to listen. As a teacher in the school district, we throw kids into an experience where they're expected to listen, and nobody's taught us how to do it. Parents don't. One of the major things as a therapist is I work with a broad demographic, but I work with a lot of teens, and one of the major concerns is they don't feel heard. And I think circles is a way I run my circle. I also started this thing called Orbit Music Club, which was I was teaching just people how to be in bands, really. I backline instruments, and but one of the things I realized is that youth are so confined to noodling in their bedroom. When I was a kid, I had to go find somebody to learn a guitar chord. Here, you just go to your computer. There's a kid in our neighborhood who was taking guitar lessons. So we would go track him down and say, okay, what's the next chord you learned? So that was like a connection. And I had to teach him how to listen. Like, if somebody's speaking, if somebody's trying to say, this is how I think this song should go. And I had to use the facilitations of circles to do that, because none of the kids were really skilled in it at all. We're so used to being in our own little world, we don't know how to connect. And one of the major ways to connect is to speak from the heart and to listen. I think one of how I run my circles is emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. And that's just a great compass rose for us to know where we are in the world and where we want to go or where we have been. And we're not a culture that, I mean culture, I mean like the kind of the Western based culture. I lived in England for a while, and there's a phrase they would say to me, is like, you all right? And I'd say, well, not so good. And then it was like, that's not what they wanted to hear. It was like a statement, not a question. You are all right. And so we're sort of get this emotional blunting that we don't have the place to exercise that anymore. And I believe circles are a great space, a safe place to exercise emotional awareness. So yeah, and I'm complete with that. I could go on, but I'll be complete with that, Nikki.
Thanks, Kenny. And we're all going to be available for some time after this if you have specific questions for Kenny, Brian, or myself. And yeah, really grateful to hear from you guys. So one of the things that we started this session with is how to engage. And in a moment, we're going to move into a practice and do some breakout rooms and actually be in a talking circle together with about 6 or 7 other people. Before we do that, I want to frame some of the process so that we can engage in this and really experience and feel it out for ourselves. And I'm going to start with the concept of group agreements. So I'm going to flip a slide back up onto the screen and share a little bit about group agreements, but then I'm going to ask you to contribute to this conversation so we get a little bit deeper understanding. So when I say group agreements, I'm really talking about a process of creating a container. And I say container to mean a vessel or a space in which something can be held and supported. Group agreements create buy-in. They foster equity, particularly when we contrast agreements to like rules or laws. And they support accountability in the sense that when agreements are broken, we have a way and a process by which we can explore what the impact of that is together. And I imagine a lot of you have participated in groups where agreements have been part of that process. And I want you to just imagine for a moment that you're going to go into a talking circle with relative or actual strangers and ask the question, what is an agreement that would be important for you to participate fully in a circle? Like, what's an agreement for you that you'd be like, yeah, that's probably a non-negotiable. I would need everybody to agree to that if I was going to opt in. And I'm willing to, if someone wants to raise their hand on Zoom, I can hear a couple voices. We have time for a couple voices. I'm also seeing some stuff in the chat, which is great. Linda's sharing no judgment. That's a common one that I hear. When we're sharing genuinely and authentically and vulnerably, we don't want to be judged. That's a real common agreement to have in group work. Gaston mentioned a talking stick. Yeah, having a way to know whose turn it is really helpful. Brian is sharing honesty, not discounting an experience. Yeah, establishing a boundary. That's really great. That could be time. It could also be, you know, like, we're going to do this work together for an hour, and then when it's over, it's over. Like, I don't want to talk about it in the grocery store. That's a big thing in a small community. For those of us who live on an island, you can relate. Listening when others speak, be present, honesty, the safety of talking in the circle. And finally, Heather saying, don't repeat my story without permission. All of these are lovely, right? These are all really important. Heather, you're really speaking to confidentiality, which I brought up at the beginning of our session, and that to me is a non-negotiable. It's really important that people can agree to not go and repeat someone else's experience or story outside of that container. And finally, let everybody have a turn. Yeah, we want everyone to have an opportunity to share. So agreements can look many different ways. If you are a facilitator or you run groups, 100% you should be spending some time to formulate group agreements with your participants. And these should be generated equitably, in that it's not you as a facilitator saying, hey, here's the 5 rules you have to abide by. Are you in? Kind of like I did at the beginning. But realistically, this should be a conversation where everybody who's part of that would be able to contribute and explore what that means to them, right? And that's where the buy-in comes in. I do a lot of work with youth, a lot of work with boys, a lot of work with boys who get into a lot of trouble. And I'll just say, when we create a space where they get to co-create agreements versus being in an institution where there's all these rules, it's a wildly different experience where all of a sudden they become very invested in the group's health and experience. And sometimes they actually start to gently police each other in the agreements and want to hold each other accountable. And it's a beautiful thing when it clicks. They realize that they are creating a culture together. And the same thing happens with adults and the men and dads that I work with. It's a really beautiful thing when we have created that safe container. So I'm going to share one more slide before we get into practice. And this is really a starting place for those who are new to this practice, and they can also be a really effective starting place of a conversation for group agreements. And I call these the 5 intentions of circle, and I don't call them agreements, particularly because they are not usually possible to actually do all the time. Like, they're intentions because I move towards them and I can intend to, or move towards, I think is a good way of referring to it for myself. But even when I'm at my best, I'm not doing it all the time. And I'm going to ask Kenny and Brian to kind of help me flesh these out a little bit before we get into practice. So it's not just my voice, but I'm going to start with the first one, and it is to speak from the heart. And I'm curious, Kenny or Brian, like, do you want to jump off and share, like, what does it mean to speak from the heart in a council process?
I'll throw something real quick, Kenny. When I first did the council process myself, I was very hesitant. I was very anxious, a little nervous about sharing with, at that time, strange strangers in my life, new men in this council. And it's easy to say, speak from the heart. I found it very hard to execute. I don't know that everybody relates that way, but that's how I was for the first couple of weeks or the first couple of circles. So to speak from the heart, I would say is you're encouraging people to be courageous, be vulnerable. I know those are sort of catchphrases these days, but they're very meaningful to prompt, I think, participants. And it's like, there's not going to be any judgment here. It will be all confidential. You may share something you're proud of. You might share something you're not proud of, but bring it from the heart so that you can get the most benefit out of it. And so can everybody else in the circle get the benefit from hearing, your truth. And I guarantee you, somebody's going to relate, if not everybody in that circle, somebody's going to relate to what you're sharing. And that's one of the great benefits of circle and council is you feel supported, not necessarily through a therapeutic lens, but through a lens of, oh, these are other men sharing a similar journey with me. We're going through the same kind of stuff. Even, I yelled at my kid about the shoes in the corner, as well. I'm not proud of that, but that's a part of it. It's like, it's bring the truth, bring the honesty, speak from the heart, because you'll get more out of it for yourself and you'll provide more out of it for the others.
Thanks, Brian. Kenny, do you want to add to listen from the heart? What does that mean to you?
Well, listen from the heart and speak from the heart are pretty much, two sides of the same coin, I think. One of the things, we talked about neuroscience, our heart has the same neurons as our brain. 70% of the heart, 70, 80% of our heart is a memory organ. It's a thinking organ, and it regulates all our hormonal distributions to go to our emotional content. I think right now in a culture that's really attuned to dissociation, we aren't really familiar with that part of ourselves. And I think the speaking and listening from the heart is a practice, and a practice we will fail at times. Do we really know what we are feeling or what we are? We won't really know until we express or until we really hear. Really hear. Sometimes you're in a circle and you listen, and it triggers this thing in the heart that you never knew was there before. So I think for the speaking and listening for the heart is just learning to have a relationship with the heart. And I think in circles is that practice for it. Yeah, complete.
I like to add too, like, I think some of my most profound moments in circle are when I hear something that I really react to, and it prompts me into a space of judgment and like, what an idiot. Like, I can't believe he did that. Brian yells at his kids. What an awful dad. And to notice that thought pattern and then be like, oh, that's my practice, right? I'm not immune to judgment. And to remember that intention and be like, okay, to listen from the heart. Like, I need to hear the human who just spoke that and not be in my judgment about it. And it's a beautiful thing. I'll go through the others kind of quickly so we can get into our practice, but to share what is essential, that's the third one. I typed these into the chat because I don't have the slide up, but that just means to get to the heart of the matter. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been in a conversation with someone who takes up all the space, but it's exhausting. And if you got a group of 6 or 12, like, you got to get to the heart of the matter and then pass the peace, like make some space for some other folks. Finally, the spontaneity, that's number 4, be spontaneous. This allows us to not rehearse. And I'm curious if anybody in here ever has the hope that they say the super profound thing in a group. You can just raise your hand if that's ever you. You're like, oh, I really want to like say this super awesome thing. Everyone's like, oh, dang, that was deep, right? But if you're sitting there rehearsing the whole time, you're not actually listening to the other people. You're not fully present. You're in your head. You're like, oh yeah, what was that quote again? And to be spontaneous is to accept that when you get the talking piece, like, you might be like, oh, I don't even know what I'm going to say right now. And something comes out, and what needs to come out is whatever comes in that moment. That's hard for me. That's hard for a lot of folks to not rehearse. And that last one is confidentiality. right? We all got to learn that nuance together of what does it mean to talk about my experience without revealing all of someone else's details. So we're going to try these on, and in a moment, Dieter's going to put us into some breakout rooms, and I'm going to flash another slide up with some instructions for us to actually lean into a practice together. Let me pull those up, and I'll share a little bit more about how this will look. So we're going to be in breakout rooms of 6 or 7 people. I'd like you to take about 2 minutes each, and I'm going to challenge you to use your whole time and not more time. So if you have a watch or a way to track time, like really try to fill your 2-ish minutes all the way up. Don't speak for 10 seconds, right? Like really give yourself some space to respond to the prompt. After the first speaker goes, so a volunteer will go first, I'd like them to choose who goes next, so we actually get some order to it. We don't have an actual circle space on Zoom, so sometimes we have to be a little bit more directive. But after you share, pick another person's name to go, and I want you to respond to this prompt, and please include your name and location. What has been your experience with fatherhood? Name, location, what has been your experience with fatherhood? Before we break, I'm going to read a poem. The poem is not meant to be directly responded to. It's just meant to, like, I don't know, fertilize whatever seeds of curiosity are out there. So you don't have to just respond or analyze the poem. The poem is meant to just land on you and in you. And then Dieter will break us out into those groups. And you'll respond to that prompt. What has been your experience with fatherhood? And here's our poem. It's called Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blueback cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made, banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. No one ever thanked him. I would wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking, when the rooms were warm. He'd call and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. What has been your experience with fatherhood? Take your 2 minutes in these breakout rooms. Dieter, go ahead and split us up, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Ooh, it's still just us, or we're the first ones to jump back in. Good. Calvin, what's your accent from? Where's your accent from? Oh, you said it, but you didn't put, you're muted still.
Yes, I'm from Texas, believe it or not.
Well, I believe it. I was thinking Arkansas, Texarkana. I wasn't sure exactly where it was. My ear's not that educated. All right,
I've lived there.
I was just filling time until you guys got back.
Nice. Well, you're good at that and other things. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I'm gonna give another like 10 seconds, as I know sometimes getting everybody back in the room can take a second, but I want you to just reflect on that experience. I want you to sit with what it was like to share and listen with a group of relative strangers on probably a personal subject, and lean into those intentions a bit, right? Speaking and listening from the heart, spontaneity, not rehearsing, all of those things. And just sit with what was that like for you? And my invitation is to hear a couple of voices. And the question I have for you is, how was that for you? And if you want to share with the whole group, just please raise your hand, and I will try to note anybody who raises their hand who's willing to share. Try to keep your shares lean, maybe a minute or less, just so we can maybe have a couple different voices of this harvest. But what was that like for you to share and to participate in that small group? All right, I got Melinda. Melinda, go ahead and unmute and yeah, let us know. What was that experience like for you?
I was actually pretty, I don't want to say surprised. I don't like that. I've kind of been following this fatherhood, increase in the role and you guys. So it's really nice to see that that's taking some momentum. I have a background in early learning, so I know the importance of those first few years of dad's involvement. Unfortunately, it's so low because sometimes there's all that turmoil. But it was really inspiring to hear some of the people and the work that they're wanting to do, especially considering that my interest is more personal and could be viewed as negative in that I didn't have a dad involved in my life. He literally, my mom said, I'm pregnant. And he said, okay, good. That's what I wanted. And then he left her. So that's been my experience. And I swore I wouldn't do that to my kids. So I've always encouraged their involvement with their dads, whether their dads were worthy or not, because that was the choice that I made. It wasn't the choice the kids made. But I always tried to encourage that because I knew there was some truth to them, their own self-worth being wrapped up in the involvement of their parents.
Thank you.
So
thank you for sharing. I got time for one other voice to just share in 30 seconds or so. What was that experience like for you in your small group? Christine Nevick, go ahead.
Couple things. I failed your instructions to not be trying to prepare what I was going to say. And then I was really moved and wanted to interact with the person who did follow your instructions and speak from the heart while I was deeply listening. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Really.
Thank you. Yeah. I imagine that we can all identify some of the constraints of doing this digitally on a Zoom call with folks that we just met, and could identify some benefits of how to improve that practice, or the imagining of doing this in person regularly and building trust, and also maybe having some skills or defined facilitation and leadership. And so I want to share a few things about facilitation for those of you who are like, okay, I already work with dads. Maybe you can run some groups, or you have established groups. Like, what are some ways that I could improve in facilitation if you are working with folks and want to step a little bit more fully into that? So a few tips that are, I want to say, great as a starting place, whether you're experienced or not in running groups, as to really engage the body. And this is really hard in Zoom, but I actually want to celebrate both Kenny and Brian because they're both excellent at facilitating and doing that in a way that includes our body and all the experiences that our body processes. This could be movement, it could be breathing, it could be really just an emotional body scan. It can be all sorts of things, but talking circles are great. And one of the things that I really feel like brings it to life is engaging the whole body. I always say use a talking piece until you reach a point where everybody is so skilled in the practice where you don't need it. That really almost never happens in most groups. And a talking piece really helps everybody understand, okay, whose turn is it to share and everyone else's opportunity to really fully listen to them. I like to start groups with a check-in. It's kind of like a warm-up, and it's an opportunity to get present with ourselves and also to share what where we're at with our group. And obviously it's helpful not to just imagine starting your group with like a really deep prompt that's vulnerable. And I didn't open us up this morning by saying, okay, welcome to the session. We're all going to type into the chat the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you. Most of us would not engage with that. But we can actually use that same prompt once we've built trust and really established some of the practice. So starting with a check-in is a great way to do that. As a facilitator, you are, I want to say, also participating in the process and modeling appropriate sharing and depth. This is different than a lot of leadership roles, or particularly in therapeutic context, where you might not be sharing your own personal stuff. And as a facilitator, you really get to set the tone for vulnerability and the way you participate and show up. For those of you that are, in a, I want to say kind of a specific role professionally and working with clients, like you might have to walk that line a little differently, but do consider that your participation in some regard is really effective for that group buy-in. And finally, have a plan, but be ready to toss it. Like sometimes things come up in a group that were unexpected that are so brilliant and powerful, and you can really leave space for what comes up in a group and trust that that's okay. And it's actually a really beautiful thing in Circle to ditch the agenda and just let what needs to happen, happen. All right. Kirk asked a good question. What's an example of a check-in question? I'm actually going to share with everybody who registered a list of some of the best practices, like facilitation tips, a sample flow, all of that. So you're going to get that via email with the email that you signed up for. But I'll give an example of a check-in prompt. That might be, okay, everybody, we're going to share our name and we're going to share our weather report. And a weather report is how you're feeling in terms of the weather. And imagine that you're not giving the full newscast, you're just giving the weather report. And so how are your emotions today in weather terms? And people can, play with that metaphor and engage and say, maybe I'm feeling cloudy with storms on the horizon. But that's an example of a check-in question that someone might use. All right, here's a sample session. And this is going to be provided to you. I'm going to go kind of quickly through it. But for those of you who are like, okay, what might an entire group session look like? Here's an example. You might open with a mindful breathing practice, do an emotion check-in where everybody can share how well are you caring for yourself these days? And you pass the talking piece around and everybody gets to respond to that in a minute or two. How well are you caring for yourself these days? I like to spend time reviewing our group agreements early in our sessions until we really, really feel clear about them all. So taking a couple minutes to review group agreements is really helpful. And then we gotta get into the heart of the process with what I call counsel rounds. And the two prompts in this sample session are, what is the difference between self-care and self-medication? And to have everybody pass the talking piece and have a chance to share. And then a second round where the facilitator would ask, what gets in the way of your self-care? What gets in the way of your self-care? This round here called Honoring and Witness. As a facilitator, I love giving some space for participants to acknowledge each other and maybe share gratitude for things that they heard. And finally, a simple checkout. What's a commitment that you could make for self-care? How can you actually commit to taking better care of yourself? And assuming this is a regular group, like there's some accountability because we're going to see each other next week. And that's a pretty powerful part of this process. So that's just a simple sample session. And I wanted to share also for those of us who have, different ways of applying these things depending on our role. Here's some ideas for how you might apply these skills. You could lead an emotion check-in at the start of a meeting. This is actually a core process at our organization where before we get into any sort of like logistical planning, business meeting, we just take 2 minutes and give everyone a chance to share how they're feeling that day. And it doesn't take up a lot of time, but it also gives us a chance to just really connect to the heart of the people in the room. So that might be something that you could do, no matter what your role is professionally. Could you use a simple circle process with an existing group that you're running? Maybe instead of just going through an agenda or a curriculum, could you include a circle round where people get to share openly using those 5 intentions? And finally, an encouragement for some of you to participate in a regular group or a facilitator training. Journeyman, our organization, does trainings. There's also several that I'll list in the resources. For the folks who really want to grow their skills in facilitating circles, there's a lot of opportunities out there to get training. And one of my hopes is that we could offer more of those for those of you who are working with dads. And for those of you who are still with me, just sharing in the chat, how are you going to apply what we covered today? What do you actually want to do with this? I'm curious to hear what you come up with. I want to share a quote from Dakota Grandmother's Open Letter to Humanity at the Leadership Rising Summit. The great vision of Black Elk foretells of the many circles, circles embracing circles, the mending of the great hoop. Let us all come together and mend all the broken hoops of the world. And I love this quote, for one, because it acknowledges the indigenous roots of circle practice, but also because it really has us focus on where this work can go and what does growth look like for circle practice. So I want to share a vision with y'all, and that vision is for every dad in Washington to experience belonging, emotional support, and empowerment through participation in leadership in circles. I'm really curious about partners for funding and research, but also implementation, and for you to consider, how can you support this movement? What part could you play in growing this as a resource for dads in every community and across Washington state? It doesn't take a lot to get a group started, and there's a really beautiful grassroots part of leadership that can emerge when dads really feel the benefit of circle practice. And a few additional books and resources. Jack Zimmerman and Gigi Coyle authored the book that really got me started in the practice. It's called The Way of Counsel. It's really beautifully written and is a great resource. A shorter read is The Little Book of Circle Process by Kay Pranis, and she's really pioneered a wide variety of circle process for different applications. But it's a really great handbook for facilitators. A few different websites to check out, waysofcounsel.net. The Mankind Project is a men's work organization that does a lot of men's groups around the country. And Illumin is also another men's work organization that does counsel groups for men in some different regions around the US and actually internationally now too. Finally, a little bit about my work and organization. So Journeymen is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based here on Vashon Island, but serve mostly Western Washington. We do training and youth development and group facilitation work. We run camps, courses, transformational leadership, trainings, and some of our groups are gender specific. And then we also do a lot of inclusive stuff. So for folks who are not male identified, wondering, can I still participate? The answer is typically yes. There's a lot of things that we do, specifically trainings that are not gender specific. And some contact and info. So I put a feedback form here that I'm not gonna refer to because Dieter is actually gonna post one in the chat for you to fill out. But if you wanna get in touch with me, you can find me online at nickywilkes.com or journeyman.us. I'm not super active on social media, but you could probably track me down. And I would just, from reading through the chat box and hearing everybody's involvement and how you are already engaged in helping dads, I would love to connect with you more and build this, to reach more people and grow this work more broadly. So thank you. And I want to leave some space for some comments and Q&A actually from you all. And then we'll have a few minutes at the very end to make sure that we just can kind of close out with some thoughts. And I saw you unmute. So do you want to jump in and hold us?
I was just going to say thank you. This is extraordinary, and we love the idea of growing a movement across this state that counteracts the social isolation that men experience and gives folks informal networks to create connections. So I'm really excited to see all the energy in the chat, and just also wanted to let you know that we will be kind of going silent for a couple months. So don't worry, we're not going away. It's just the end of our grant and the beginning of a new one. So I don't want people to think, usually at this point we would say, yes, and we'll see you next month at the next series, but not this month. So we'll be back in January, and we'll be focusing on collaborative divorce and peaceful co-parenting. So it's always a topic that people want to get more involved in, but I just wanted to recognize the energy around this idea and thank people for, as you said, Nikki, the grassroots. I would say this is our work, right? As a collective of people that support families, this is our work, and so we're working hard to make it not an afterthought but essential. So thanks for sharing this with us, and I didn't see any questions in the chat that are hanging out, but I
Kirk's
haven't
got a
typed
hand up.
anything.
Kirk, why don't you lead us off? So you can type
Um,
questions in the chat or raise your hand.
I'm a good kind of visual person. Typing for me is like I'm the men's service manager at a pregnancy clinic in Everett. And I'm here to engage with the male partners of patients that come to the clinic. I am looking to start a men's group, but men don't seem to be that interested in it, or not, what's the right word? I don't know, vulnerable or trustworthy enough to kind of step into that circle. So this might be an obvious question, Nikki, but how do you start a group or kind of stir up enthusiasm to get men to come to a group?
Yeah. You mean, Kirk, if you post a flyer that says, come be vulnerable with other random men, that dudes aren't going to show up? Yeah, that's been my experience too. I've learned a lot about messaging, and one of the things that I want to say is effective for us is leaning on personal relationships and personal invites. Like we do get, I think, men who like, and dads who see flyers or like randomly see stuff online and opt in, but for vulnerable work, like especially with men who've been conditioned to not be vulnerable, it often takes someone that they trust to be like, hey, I'm doing this thing that I think you'd really enjoy, and it's powerful, and you know it's deep work, but like I think you'll really get something out of it. That's effective, and I want to say that to the extent that you can lean on trusted existing relationships is great. We also get wives and mothers who are like, hey, I really want you to do this, and for some men that's motivating. Some men have been like, my wife told me that I should go here, and so I'm here. And then they stay because it's really powerful. But I'm also curious too, between, you know, Kenny and Brian, like if you have anything else you want to share with that, because enrollment can be challenging.
I'd like to share right quick, Kirk. Recognize and acknowledge that yeah, this is awkward. This might not be your first choice to how to spend a Tuesday night for 6 weeks in a row or whatever. I always recognize that. It's like as Nikki says, like come be vulnerable with random strange dudes. You're not going to get a lot of signups. But if you recognize like, yeah, it might be kind of awkward, but it's a really great payoff, and it'll help you. It'll help you be a better father. It's better for your partner. It's better for your children. You know, recognize the awkwardness, but then sell the benefits. That's kind of how I throw it.
Yeah, I think, and maybe sell it as the alternative place, right? I had a teacher who was talking about this guy Dale Close, and he's talking about like how he misses the days where men just went to the bar and women stayed home. And I was like, and then he goes, hear me out. And so he goes, it was a place where we could talk. It was a place where men could talk. And I sort of understood him a little bit more. And this is long before I was working in with Journeyman, but I thought, how do you frame it as a place that's alternative to where you can like connect?
Mhm.
That it's not, looking at the mirror in front of you to the person you're talking next to, right? A place where you might find support that's an alternative to what our culture has said is the modality that we should have.
Mhm.
And Nikki, I might add another thought to Kirk. We do a series of community cafes around the state that bring fathers together, and often those are dads who want to do more. And so I'm saying this to you, but I'm really saying it to the room, that if you want to find dads that have already said, hey, I want to do more, just give us a shout. Dieter has put a lot of links in the chat to our website. Chances are we know some folks in your area. And if you're up in North Sound, we've done several cafes up there. And we've done a lot of work with WIC in that area and some of the primary care providers. I mean, there's quite a few folks. And so to Nikki's point, if you find some dads who've already gotten activated a little bit, that can walk with you to find other folks, that might give you a starting point as well. So if you reach out to us at info@ and then the address that Dieter's going to put in the chat, chances are we know some dads in your area.
Awesome. Yeah, some other things to think about with enrollment, like reducing barriers. My dream is that all these would always be free. There'd be funding for this, and maybe that will be possible one day. We charge a fee for a lot of our groups and do a sliding scale, and we always say yes if someone can't fund it personally, because we just want it to be available, and we go out and fundraise so that can be possible. I also want to share a strategy too. I heard about this version. It's actually from Australia, and what the Australian government realized was men would show up to like fix-it cafes when there was a job to do, and it was like sneaky because there was a mental health component, and so they would like invite neighborhood men over to fix like a lawnmower, and that was the hook. And then when they were there, they would just casually start asking mental health questions. And so my thought is like, what's the hook? Can you get guys to show up to a barbecue or like whatever, and then halfway through you like, hey, while we're here, facilitate a meaningful moment, and then go from there and see. It's like, if you're interested in some more of this, right, like here's what might be possible. And that Australian example is just hilarious to me, in that it actually has gone on for quite some time. Oh, it's like the Shed Project. I need to figure out the name specifically.
Yeah, I funded a program once, Nikki, that was called Parenting Under the Hood.
Yeah, there you
Shoulder to
go.
shoulder car repair, talking about parenting. It was super cool.
Amity asked a great question. Are these normally drop-in or a series? We've done both. And I think it's most powerful in a series where you get people to commit to 8 weeks or 10 weeks. And generally, one of the agreements is that you show up and you aim to be there every time, because having people drop out like really affects the energy. But you also don't want people just joining randomly, right, after you've built trust. And then in the summertime, we've often done drop-in groups that are meant for people to come and get a taste and be like, is this something I would want to commit to? And so we're kind of learning that cadence, like an every once in a while drop-in is a great way for folks to get a sample and then use that as, okay, I actually really liked that. I want to sign up for a 10-month thing or a 10-week thing and just be consistent with a group.
And as a council, we would love to support you in any way you want to move forward. And if you reach out to us, we can include you in outreach if we get resources for groups like this. Right now, we don't have any, but we are continually shaking our cup and beating the bushes.
Well, right on. I think we got to the specific questions I saw in the chat. I also want to acknowledge how many awesome links and resources y'all shared in the engagement. As a facilitator, I love when people show up to participate or engage. This has been really rich for me, and I sense for everybody because of that engagement. So thank you so much. And thanks for showing up. For you dads in the audience who are asking the question, how can I be a solid dad and better father? And also for the providers out there who've chosen to work in a field that I think speaks to each of our hearts. So thank you so much.
Could we get one last parting thought from Kenny and Brian about, if you could say one thing to a group of providers that are supporting fathers about supporting dads What would you want them to know?
You can find help. It feels lonely. I'm a single father since I have a 9-year-old, and I've been a single dad since she was 1.5. Circles are a great place to just find support. And as a therapist, one of the struggles with teens is that they never feel heard. You might think you're listening, but there's a real art to being heard. And circles can really develop that, and that attunement that they get. And this is the big thing, like what's the attunement that happens when you're heard. And we have a great exercise in the dad passing the torch camp of, the father's just listening. There's no reply. They just hold space. And that's really what I think youth need. They just need to be seen and heard. And it's a skill, and it's an art, and it's a place to settle down, just to slow down. And we're like a dissociative culture. We're just everything, our phones, everything is so quick. Even this meeting I felt was a little too quick, but
Sorry about that.
yeah, no worries. No, it's the way the world is. But how do we slow down and create that attunement together?
Thanks.
I throw a quick concluding thought is take a chance as a participant in a council or as a facilitator for a council and put one together. And you may have a struggle recruiting a couple of people, but say you only get 2 men that want to do it, you're gonna be helping those 2, and you're gonna get the word out through them. Take a chance with this council work because it's really beneficial. It's very much worth taking the risk of it.
Thank you. Nikki, did you have a last thought, or have you already said it?
Yeah, I'm present with gratitude, and I think the one thought I have too is particularly those of you who hold a lot of space for others, I hope you find a space where you can be held, right? And for those of you who are in a therapeutic context or work in DSHS, et cetera, like caseloads, all that, like, are you finding a regular space where you can process that with someone else who gets it and really hear you? Maybe you can find a mutually supportive group where you share facilitation, but just hold each other in that. I know I need that from time to time, and it's a beautiful thing. So I hope we all get to be held in a similar way.
Super important. Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's always wonderful when your wisdom joins our conversation. Thanks, Kenny and Brian, for expanding on that wisdom. Appreciate all that Journeyman does, and just reiterate with folks, if you have any questions, thoughts, interest in starting groups, and want to connect to dads around the state, let us know. And we will see you again in January. Have a wonderful holiday season in whatever you celebrate and however you celebrate it, and support a dad along the way. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
for joining
everybody.
us.
Bye, everybody.